Welcome back to the Shabbos Treasures series. I'm Gila Ross, host of the Power Up podcast, and I'm here together with my co-host,
Rabbi Samuel Ross, and we are delighted to be able to share a weekly idea that you can take into your Shabbos and upgrade and beautify immediately. Enjoy. Last week we started our brand new section of cooking, baking, cooking, and we looked at an introduction to cooking. And what we really saw was that cooking, yes, of course, it's talking about food, but it's not necessarily food. Like any substance that you're heating up is cooking. You remember, for example, you remember the Kiddush cup? You know, when the melted wax falls on the Kiddush cup, pouring the hot water. So that is as much a problem as, I don't know, to put something in your oven. That is cooking. So that was a large part of what we saw last week and the ramifications of that. Of course, we saw it in terms of driving a car, etc., etc., etc. So we are swiftly moving on with cooking. And as I wrote, it's a very exciting one for your English folk. Actually for us Canadian folk too, but especially for the English folk, because of course, tea is such a huge part of life. But we are going to see tonight about making a good old cup of tea, right? What do you call it in England?
Tea.
But not a cuppa of tea. What do you call it?
A brew.
A brew, of course.
It depends how common you are.
Okay. It doesn't depend whether you come from Leeds or Manchester. I'm going to leave this particular one right there. Okay. We are essentially going to look at three questions tonight. The first one is, and let me ask all of you this question. What about putting spices, I don't know, pepper, let's say black pepper, spices, into a boiling hot pot of chicken soup that's on the flame? So picture it, you've got your flame, whether it's a real flame, which is covered with some sort of metal blech, whether it's on a hot plate, it doesn't matter what it is, it's on a flame. And I got my boiling hot pot of chicken soup, and I realized I forgot to put black pepper in it.
You're not allowed to do that.
Wow, you sound pretty strong. I'm being told you're not allowed to do that.
I'm wondering if you can take the chicken soup off the flame and maybe let it cool a bit, then add the black pepper. I don't know if that would be more acceptable.
So Darren is saying maybe yes. Maddie's adamant no. What do Richard and Bev think?
Darren was so authoritative with his original no that I'm simply bowled over by that.
Okay, so Richard doesn't want to take you on. We're going to come back to this again. The first question, then, brother, you've broadened the question. Part one and part B, part two, which is spices into a pot that's on the flame as opposed to off the flame. Next question: what about putting milk and sugar into a hot coffee? Let's pretend we're Canadian for now, American. We're having a coffee rather than the tea. What about pudding? I've got
Yes, you can, but you have to do it a different way, in a different order than you would normally.
Okay, so we'll see about the order, but apparently you can do that. We'll have to see. And the third question is making a cup of tea. How do you do this on Shabbos?
I think it's got to be via a bit like what Maddie said, but it's via like a third method. So you put something into something and then something into the other thing.
Okay, so we'll have to see exactly how that's going to pan out.
Yeah.
By the way, question 2 and question 3, we'll see in a few minutes, are different. Question 2 was about the cup of coffee, but question 2 was, really, again, we'll see in a minute about the second vessel, and question 3 is maybe going to be more about the third vessel. But that's what we're going to look at. We're going to look at really, and this is what we're going to look at over the next few minutes, which is there are 3 vessels. You've got the first vessel, the second vessel, and the third vessel. Does anyone have any idea what I'm talking about? I sound like I'm describing some sort of ancient, I don't know, Greek or something. What is a first vessel, a second vessel, and a third vessel?
So the first vessel is where say it's water. So if you were going to make a cup of tea, so your first vessel is the Shabbos kettle.
Perfect. So let's just start there for Maddie. Absolutely perfect. So give an example. The first vessel, because we're going to see in a minute that they're going to have different laws for each one. But the first vessel is the one which is let's say the urn, or it's the pot of chicken soup or something like that.
Yeah.
Okay. What's the second vessel?
So say to make a cup of tea, the first vessel's your Shabbos kettle. The second vessel would be a cup to pour the water into.
Okay, great, perfect, Maddie. So the second one is So what I've done is I've poured from my hot urn into a cup. So again, we'll discuss in a couple of minutes, what can I put in that cup? Okay, but that's the second vessel. What's the third vessel?
The actual cup you're going to drink out of, because you have to pour the water into the third vessel.
So Maddie, you're already ahead. You're really good. You're already ahead. So again, we'll see soon. Sometimes you don't. Sometimes you can use a second. Sometimes you have to use a third. We'll see soon. But the point is, the first one is the urn or the boiling hot soup in the pot. The second one is what you pour it into, whether it's the bowl or whether it's the plate or whether it's the cup. And then the third one is if you pour it into even another one. Okay, so that's what we're going to look at. And each one has a different category of halacha and a different category of how the heat can be used to heat, in particular, uncooked liquids and foods. Now, the following I want to point out, I don't want to spend too long on this because I'm not a scientist. It does get very confusing on a scientific level, and I'll tell you why. Because this is the premise that we're going with. We're saying you've got your first vessel, which is the urn, second vessel, which is a cup, and the third one is another cup. And we're going to say that each one as you go down is slightly less stringent. Okay? This is the problem. In science, I could in theory have a second vessel which could be cooler than the third vessel. Meaning, let's say I pour it into the second vessel, and now for whatever reason it's cooled down a little bit. It's a few minutes later, but it's the second vessel. But I could find a third vessel where the walls didn't really cool it down so much. So I'm going to tell you the following. What we're going to have to deal with on some level, we're going to have to accept, because it does get very confusing, is going to be more halachik than necessarily scientific. Otherwise, we're going to start getting ourselves very confused, because otherwise we're going to look at it, that doesn't make any sense, because, well, the third vessel, in theory, if it's polystyrene, maybe is hotter than the second vessel, which is a different material. So for our purposes, we're going to have to say it's not purely the level of heat, but there's other elements. But again, we're going to assume that all things being equal, it's going to be slightly less hot as you're going along, and that halachically in Jewish law, that there are other factors such as the walls of the vessels that are cooling things off as you go along. Okay? That's how we're looking at it. So that's where we're starting from. Vessel 1, which is the urn. Vessel 2, which is the cup you pour it into. Vessel 3, which is the cup you pour that into as well. Okay. So, guys, I've already asked, Maddie's already answered this. Give me an example of the first vessel. So Maddie gave the urn. Someone else give a different example. Bev, you were speaking, but you're muted.
I was going to say that like a cholent pot, but is it more for drinks?
No, you're right. The cholent pot, absolutely. My pot of cholent. So there are two ways that this could happen, and Darren was discussing this earlier, and Richard was scared to dare, God forbid, disagree with Darren. But you could have the cholent pot that's on the flame, or after you've taken it off and it's on your counter. Hopefully it doesn't burn your counter, right? But let me ask you, what are you allowed on Shabbos to put into that cholent pot?
Food.
I'll give you an example. Let me give you a real example. Let's say you realize, oh my goodness, I forgot to put salt in my chicken soup, or I forgot to put ketchup into my my Mexican cholent this week. It's in the first vessel. What am I allowed to put in the first vessel?
Is it something if it's added for good, not for? Is it to do with that?
What can we put into?
Oh, I know. Don't you scoop? Aren't you allowed to say scoop some of the? You could take a ladle of cholent out, put the ketchup in that ladle, and then put it back in. Are you allowed to do it that way, Matt?
So in terms of putting things back in, we're going to start discussing that maybe a little bit next week about reheating and putting things back in. And there are some cases you can put things back in, but I want to tell you, you can never put something back onto something that's on the flame. Once something's on the flame, forget about it. Nothing goes in it. The only discussion we are going to be having is once it's off the flame. So I've got my cholent pot, and now that's Bev's example, and it's off the flame. It's on my counter. What can I put into my cholent pot or my chicken soup that's now off the flame? It's boiling hot.
Anything then.
So this is what you're allowed to put in. It's actually very limited.
Spoon to take it out.
I'm sorry?
A spoon to serve it. That's about all you can do.
Okay, so I'll tell you what you can put in. You could put in any solid food that is already completely cooked once it's off the flame. So let me give you an example. You would be allowed to put in a piece of cold cooked chicken into the pot of hot chicken soup that's off the flame, because it's already cooked and it was cooked the same way. But let's say you had a baked piece of chicken or a baked crouton. You couldn't put it into the chicken soup. That's off the fire. Okay. I want to be clear again. Everyone's clear. My chulent pot, what can I put onto it only once it's off the fire? I can remember Darren and Maddie were having a bit of a debate about this. It's only something that's completely cooked and then off the fire. Okay. Question? Okay, so that's the first vessel, the chulent pot, the pot of soup, etc., etc. The only thing that goes into it once it's off the flame is something that was already fully cooked. Like, I'll give you another example. Those of you who work in the kitchen, how do you cook noodles?
Hot water.
Hot water. So now my noodles are cold, or a matzo ball, it's cold. Under what circumstances could I put that into a first vessel, into my chulent pot, into my pot of chicken soup?
If it's off the flame.
Perfect. Because it's cooked in the same way. It's cooked. So once it's off the flame, I can put it in. So that's the first vessel. And again, now we're going to go to the second vessel. What is the second vessel? It's the one you pour it into, right? It's the one you pour it into. Okay, which we assume has a lower heat than the first vessel because the walls have cooled it off a little bit. So now we're going to look at what you could put into it. So the truth is, in practical terms, you don't put, and I'll write this all up and put it in the group, you don't put that much more into a second vessel than you put into a first vessel. There are a few things extra, but even though it's, there is an assumption that it cooks less, you don't put very many things into it. I'll tell you the sort of things you can put into it. You could put water into it, oil, salt, pepper, cinnamon, ginger, things like that. And you could also warm a bottle of milk. Let's say you've got a bottle of, baby's milk. Well, the milk has already been pre-cooked. It's pasteurized. So you're allowed to put it into a second vessel, but that's about it. Second vessel, don't put too much into that. Maybe you'll put your baby's bottle to warm up with the milk because it's already pasteurized, into the into the pot, into the second vessel, into your cup. Or you could put, salt or things like that, oil, water, but you don't put that much more into a second vessel. Once I've done all three, we're going to sum up and go back to our original questions. What about the third vessel? So again, the third vessel is I've got my hot plate, my kettle. I pour it into a cup, and then it goes into another cup.
The third vessel is something like the tea bag or the coffee granules,
right,
or the
perfect, Darren. So that's the way we're going to make tea on Shabbos. It's true that there are those who are stringent, and there are some things they won't put into a third vessel, but there's definitely opinions that we can rely on, Moshe Feinstein and others, that once it gets put into a third vessel, so again, I get my hot water from the urn, put it into a second cup, put it into the third cup, then I can put the tea bag in, then I can put then I can put even coffee in. But you could let's use the example of the tea bag. What you're not allowed to do is first vessel into a cup, put the tea bag into an empty cup, and then pour it onto it. You can't do that. You can only pour the water once the tea bag is in the third. You can only put the tea bag in once the water is in the third vessel.
So the water's always got to be first before the coffee, the sugar.
Yeah, because otherwise what you're doing is you're pouring into a third vessel, which may be looked at as a second vessel.
All right.
So again, let's go back to our three questions at the beginning. Question one was, are you allowed to put spice into a pot that's on the flame?
No.
Absolutely not. Because what about if it's off the flame?
Yes.
No, you're not. I don't think
you add it once it's into the bowl, which is the third vessel.
Yeah, so that's the third. We're right now looking at the first one. So the first one, it would have to be something that's properly cooked, cooked the same way, and you can put it in. But you're talking about noodles and a cold piece of boiled chicken, something like that.
Well, can I just ask, why is it different then once it's served and it's still very hot and there's some table salt and you put some salt on? Why is that different?
So perfect, Richard. You are asking the big questions, which is why I gave that introduction at the beginning, which is we have to accept that on some level, this is going to be halachik rather than scientific. That's why I gave that.
Is it okay? Is it okay because it's off the flame, so it's not cooking? You're not changing anything. once
So
it's in the
you
bowl.
and Richard, right? So you and Richard are sort of asking the same question. This is the reality. If you look at it scientifically, it's possible that the third vessel is still very, very hot. It is possible. You know, I'm with you, Richard. Hostess, one of the early commentators already asked this question. And the basic approach is that, yes, there is some sort of cooling going on, you know, with the walls of the vessel, but you can't totally attribute it to it because scientifically, you may get yourself into a lot of trouble. It has to be a halachik principle as well. Again, if you want to do it in more detail, we could look at this. There's a Tosfos, one of the early commentators that speaks about it. There are those, I wasn't going to get into this, but I'm going to a little bit. It's possible that when something, you know, when something is like a chillant, it stays even hotter once it goes onto the plate. So there you may want to be a little bit strict, you know, if it's a solid. But I'm not going to go that far. Maybe you want to be a little bit more careful, you know, because maybe that solid mass maintains its heat. But all things being equal, with that possible exception, we look at it that halachically in Jewish law, it has to be down enough. But again, and that was why I gave that introduction. You can't totally look at this scientifically. It's one of these really, really, I'll try and send something around to the group about this. It's one of the really, really difficult questions, okay? It can't be that it's just purely heat. It has to be more to it, that it's deemed that once it's hitting the wall, something is happening to it halachically as well. I don't know what else to tell you. You're asking the big question, and you're not the first one to ask it. Like one of the early commentators from a couple of thousand years ago was asked, it's like, it scientifically doesn't work. It's the big question. Okay, that's the first vessel. Our second question was, what about putting milk and sugar into a hot coffee that's in a second vessel?
Got to be in the third.
So this is the situation. In a second vessel, we saw there's very few things that practically we add, but you are allowed to put in your milk and your sugar. So a coffee, because it's like this, the coffee granules, as opposed to a tea bag, are already fully cooked, right? They're fully cooked. And milk or water or sugar, you could put into a second vessel. So again, you want to put into the third one, great, but you would allow people to put that into the second one. Whereas if I asked you, the third question was how to make the cup of tea, where does that have to go into? The third one. So again, look, I think it's good practice to put things in the third one because then you're pretty much covered. You know, you're always going to be covered, at least according to Ramosha Feinstein. Make it easier on yourself, just using it. I always have an extra cup under my urn. So I pour it in and I just straight away pour it into a third one, even if it's a coffee, whatever it is. You know, because then you're covering yourself.
People always ask for tea and coffee as well. Like you never get everyone just wanting one drink. So you're going to get confused.
So just have the thing there to sort of remind yourself. It's a little bit more lenient with the second one in some things. You know, you could put you know, your milk or your sugar or your oil or something like that. But third, just make it easy for yourself. Put it into the third one, and you're good to go. You know, it's such an easy thing. You know, wherever we are at our own level of Shabbos observance, but you know, we're making our tea on Shabbos, making our coffee. You know, just by reversing an order perhaps and putting the water into the third vessel and then putting the tea bag in. You know, I made a point of observing Shabbos. That's really where I want to be. I think that makes a big statement. You know, even if I'm not there in every other regard, which I think is a really beautiful thing. You know, one step at a time and do what I can. You know, things that are there and I can do. So I think we've had a bit of a look tonight at the first vessel. Don't put anything into it on the fire. Off the fire, it's something that's already cooked. The same way, the noodles, the cold piece of chicken, or whatever it is. Second vessel, really not very much. You've got your water, oil, ginger, things like milk or sugar. Maybe your coffee, and then the third vessel, you know, you can pretty much put anything into that.
Thank you for taking the time to listen. To schedule a complimentary discovery call with Gila, please email gilaross@gmail.com. You can also learn more from Gila on Instagram. It's Gila Ross. And please take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss out. Have a wonderful day.